Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to start officially our unit on evolution. And we're going to start off with chapter 22, and this is really going to be a bit more of a broader overview topic, overview chapter, I should say. We'll dig deeper into the concepts as we continue to move throughout this unit, but this chapter's point really is to give you just some context and talk a little bit more about Darwin himself. What sort of influences did he have based on things that were going on in the world at the time of his putting together of these ideas of evolution, and then just sort of the overarching ideas of what his theory ended up saying, and what sort of evidence did he use, as well as we continue to use to support the idea of evolution. So hopefully at this point you are well aware that Charles Darwin is given the credit as being the father of evolution. He gets that note in history really based on the fact that on November 24th, 1859, he officially publishes On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And this is a big, great essay on all of the things that he had been studying throughout his life, what sort of pieces led him to saying that natural selection is in fact a natural process that is what allows life to look the way it does, and how it's going to continue to change and be shaped by nature itself. So it really focuses biologists' attention on this great diversity of organisms. And his major points were to present evidence that many species of organisms currently inhabiting Earth had to have been descendants of ancestral species. And he does this in a way that proposes a mechanism for evolution, and that's what we now talk about as natural selection. So evolution really is this overarching process, overarching theory, idea, but the actual, if we drill into the way that it works, natural selection is what that comes down to. He didn't actually really use the term natural selection per se, but he did use this phrase descent with modification, which we now layer into that mechanism of natural selection. So he gives evolution a way to be viewed both as a pattern, so this constant thing that crops up in nature at every organism that we look at, and then proposes the process by which that pattern exists. So when we look at natural selection as this mechanism for evolution, it really comes down to some big key pieces here. And this stuff is going to continue to come up again and again and again as we move through this unit. But it's differential success. And I can't stress more the importance of differential success in this term right here. It really absolutely comes down to reproduction. So we're going to throw that term survival of the fittest out there here and there as we continue to work through this unit. But when we talk about fitness from an evolutionary standpoint, it's not just about being tough or strong or simply surviving. You have to be able to reproduce better than other individuals in your population. That's what natural selection is being driven by. So when we look at populations, there has to be differential success in the ability to reproduce, and that's going to get tied back to those different phenotypes. And hopefully that word sounds familiar to you. When we talk about phenotypes, remember we're talking about different physical manifestations of your genetic material. So being blonde versus brunette, blue eyes versus brown eyes, tall versus short, all of that has context driving back to your DNA. That's another important piece to this. So it's differential reproductive success based on different phenotypes, which really ultimately means that this is genetically controlled. And if you think about it, reproduction really comes down to egg plus sperm being passed on into an offspring, or an organism who asexually reproduces and passes its genetic information on to its offspring by budding or binary fission or some sort of asexual process. So when we talk about reproduction, it really is genetic reproduction. We're passing those genes on to the next generation, and that's the physical manifestation of that is what natural selection works on. So the result ultimately of natural selection is that overarching evolutionary adaptation. It's the culmination of inherited characteristics that ultimately fit a set of criteria in a particular environmental setup that allows that population to then reproductively be successful. So that does include survival, but the traits that we're really driving home are the ones that allow them to be better reproductively successful. If I take that organism and I throw him into another environment, that set of traits that had been accumulating in that organism may or may not be beneficial in that new environment. So that's another piece to keep in mind. We're looking at a set of traits in a given situation. I move that organism to something different, and that organism may no longer be successful. So evolution is working both at a macroscopic scale, where we're looking at physical characteristics that we can kind of see with our eyes, but it's all being driven underlyingly by these frequencies of alleles. And maybe that term sounds familiar too. So remember when we talk about alleles in genetics, we're talking about your sort of capital A's, lowercase a's, your dominants versus your recessives. And when we go through meiosis, right, to make your sex cells, those alleles get separated out so that every egg has a single allele for every trait that that organism needs. Sperm, same deal. When they come back together, it's the combination now of mom's allele and dad's allele that then determines the phenotype in the offspring. So when we look at evolution, we're looking at the frequencies of these alleles in your gene pool, which is the collection of all potential alleles in that given population. So when we get to some population genetics in the coming chapters, that's going to come back up. Overarchingly, if we were to define evolution, it's all the changes that we have seen that have transformed life on Earth from its earliest beginnings to the diversity that we characterize it by today. So taking a look at single-celled organisms, how do we get to what we're talking about when we look at all of the diversity of life that we see on Earth now? And evolution really is the pattern for which we can describe that change. So let's take a step back for a minute. So rather than really diving into Darwin's theory of evolution, which we'll definitely be discussing, let's just put his ideas into some context. So when we look at Darwin, he's working in the mid 1800s. He ultimately publishes in 1859, and there's a lot of scientific sort of revolution going on that's changing these traditional views. So take us a step back and just think of general public. Religion is huge to their way of life at this point. And as Darwin is growing up and as he's working on these theories, that religious view of how Earth was created and how it was created exactly like we are viewing it and seeing it and experiencing right now, that was the predominating view. So God created Earth in 7 days. This is exactly what he meant to create, and nothing has changed since then. Darwin's going to come in and very much shake up those views. Not only does the literal reading of the Bible say the earth has never changed, but it also suggests it's much younger than some of the geologists working at Darwin's time are also starting to challenge. So we look at both Darwin and these other geologists working at the time, who we'll mention in just a moment, really challenging this traditional view of the fact that the earth was not as young as a literal reading of the Bible suggests, nor is it unchanging. So there's a lot of influence that actually is going to come from the geologic studies that are going to ultimately influence Darwin on his journey to writing The Origin of Species. So ultimately, this is sort of the biggest context, right? So he's writing this Origin of Species, and in fact, he's terrified. All right, when he gets to putting these ideas down on paper, he really doesn't want to publish. He's quite certain that he is correct, that every piece of evidence he continues to come across continues to support his ideas, and yet he knows the potential ridicule that's going to come from challenging these ideas of Earth being only a few thousand years old. He's already seeing some of that coming out of geology. He also knows that suggesting that all of life started as one thing and has changed over time to give us the diversity that we see, including humans, also is going to set him up for some serious ridicule. So, in fact, he actually decides to establish a way to publish his work after he dies so he doesn't have to deal with that potential ridicule face to face. That being said, there's a lot of influence in the scientific community for giving him these sort of nudges in the right direction. One of those is actually pre him back in the 1700s, so before he's even born, gentleman named Carolus Linnaeus, and this is sort of the founder of our modern taxonomy system. So giving our organisms that sort of kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, right? Now Linnaeus takes that branch of biology and says there's huge diversity on Earth. There has to be connections to it. And so he comes up with this naming and classifying system known as taxonomy. That's where the naming system, the binomial nomenclature, comes from, that we use as scientific terms, right? Your genus and your species. And so he's sort of the first one to really recognize the amount of diversity that exists, but also recognizes that when I look at two different flowers next to each other, they might both be tulips, although different species of tulips. And so he sort of starts bridging that gap, that there's relationships between organisms that look and act similar. Another huge influence is going to come from the geology. And several geologists are working sort of pre as well as current to Darwin himself. And this is where Darwin's going to get some of his support for his theory. Fossils, paleontology, this is going to be a big one for him. So the study of fossils really sort of lays that groundwork for Darwin because it starts to give us a timeline. So when we look at fossils, right, a fossil by definition is simply a preserved remnant or an impression of an organism that lived at some point in the past. When we talk about studying fossils, first off, they are only found in sedimentary rock. So sedimentary rock means that there has to be water involved. So in order to build sedimentary rock, right, we get water runoff from a continent or some sort of landform. As those rivers wash that sediment down to something like a lake or the ocean, where things are moving slower, that sediment can fall out of solution and sort of sink down to the bottom, and they build on top of each other in layers. If they get eroded away, then we can start seeing those layers. Pay attention to any of the road crops or cuts or anything like that that you might be driving past, and we can see them everywhere. We've got a lot of it around here. But what this ends up doing is now setting up a timeline. The deeper the layer in Earth, the older that material is, because everything new has to layer on top of it. Gets compressed, turns into rock over time. And what they end up finding as they're studying through these fossils is that there are things that look distinctly different from what currently exists, as well as things that look similar but not quite like what currently exists. And so this starts to spark Darwin's ideas of, well, if the Bible's telling me things have never changed, then how do I reconcile that with this information that I'm seeing? So paleontology ultimately gets developed by a gentleman named Georges Carver. And he's really the one who sort of puts out these ideas of deeper or older strata, which are those layers. Strata is just another word for a layer. The more dissimilar the fossils looked from current life. And as we continue to get one layer higher and higher and higher, we saw new species appear, we saw new fossils that disappeared completely, some that looked more and more similar to what we have currently living. So there were all of these changes that they were noticing as they were doing this. And this really opposed the idea of gradual evolutionary change. So Carver was this huge component, or proponent, I should say, advocate for this idea of catastrophism. Um, and this is one of the geologic theories that's floating around as Darwin is starting to develop and study nature in general, and then on his way to putting together this idea of evolution. So Carver's idea of catastrophism simply states that it's a hypothesis that each boundary between those layers, between those strata, is a time in history of a huge catastrophe, a flood, a drought, something like that, that destroys many species and has huge impacts on the landscape of Earth itself. That being said, gradualism is sort of the other piece to this at the time, and James Hutton, the gentleman here in the portrait, is saying that it's the exact opposite, that all of the change that we see on Earth is slow and gradual and continuous. So Carver's in here saying big, huge catastrophes, destroys lots of things, sort of snap change. Where Hutton's saying no, it's kind of slow in the background. You almost wouldn't notice it if you didn't know to look for it. Then comes Charles Lyell, who will ultimately be given the title of the father of geology. And he comes up with this idea or this theory of uniformitarianism, which really just takes Carver's work of huge catastrophes and Hutton's work of gradualism and kind of throws them together. He kind of puts them into a more comprehensive view and really says it's kind of a little of both. So there's definitely slow, gradual change. Think of things like weathering of rocks, right? Eroding a riverbank over time. But then we also know things like earthquakes and volcanic eruptions have huge effects as well, and they're much more catastrophic. So Lyell takes both of those and says the changes that we've seen in Earth's landscape are a result of both processes. You've got slow things changing the landscape, you've got huge catastrophes that are shaping landforms as well. And all of these pieces really end up influencing Darwin as this continuous action, also recognizing the idea that Earth has to be a lot older than he was ever taught, which gives him some freedom to say that it's possible for life on Earth to have had much more time to change. Something else that's also going on at the time of Darwin is a contemporary to him, and that's this gentleman named Lamarck. He's working on this theory sort of predating, it kind of comes back to Darwin just starting. And Lamarck's ideas are interesting, but ultimately don't hold up. But in Darwin coming across his ideas, it sort of sparks some thoughts. So let's take a look at Lamarckian evolution for a second. And Lamarck really pushes this idea of use and disuse. So if I use parts of my body extensively because theoretically they're beneficial to me, then they're going to be longer and stronger, while the ones that I don't use sort of just deteriorate and kind of we get rid of them over time. So Lamarck's really looking at this idea of acquired characteristics, where organisms are capable of passing on those acquired traits that they develop within their lifetime to their offspring. And the classic example of Lamarckian evolution are these giraffes, right? So Lamarck is sort of proposing historically giraffes had short necks, they reach up to eat the leaves in the trees. As they continue to eat the lower lying branches and they sort of disappear, then they've got to stretch even further to get to the higher branches to get their food. Okay, so they have now strengthened and lengthened the muscles in their neck over their lifetime, stretching for those slightly higher leaves, and so they'll pass on to their offspring that slightly longer, slightly stronger neck. Next generation comes around and the same process happens over again. They eat all the lower lying branches, so now they move up higher, longer, stronger necks, pass them off to the offspring until we get to the generation of giraffes we're seeing currently who have these big, long, strong necks, right? Makes sense. Don't fall into Lamarckian evolution. A lot of students do because the logic makes sense to them. And I totally get it. The problem here is that those acquired characteristics fail the genetic component to natural selection. Acquired characteristics are things like you going out and training to be a better soccer player or training to be a better piano player, right? Those are skills that you may have some innate ability to be better at because of some sort of muscular bone structure, whatever the case might be, right? Well, the pieces that are making up your muscle and bone structure, that you can pass on, but you're never going to pass on the actual skills that you pick up in the training for playing soccer or the training for playing that piano. Your kids are not going to come out being amazing soccer stars. They're going to have to work for it. They're going to have to train for it. Their bone structure, their muscle structure may allow them to be better and quicker at that training, but they still have to train. That's where Lamarck fails. Those acquired characteristics are not written in your genetic information, and as a result, you can't pass them on.